All right, we're about to come up on time. And we're going to make a start with the presentation about the medication workflow. So my name is Rene, but you have read my intro in the agenda, so no need to repeat that. So let's have a look at medication workflow. Well, first of all, what's the aim of this particular presentation? Well, to show you what FHIR offers, an overview of what FHIR offers when in support of medication workflows. What are actually our learning goals? Well, to have this overview of the various medication resources and to look at the interesting use case of applying the medication, or actually the creation of the current medication list. And this is one of the problems that quite a lot of countries are facing, or regional projects, is how do you create the list of medications that the patient is currently taking? And it's not enough to just look at the prescriptions, because 15% or thereabouts of all prescriptions is never picked up. And the third learning goal is to look at some of the workflow resources that are used to support this workflow, notably the order and results workflow here. There is no prerequisite knowledge here, and no prior knowledge of the medication resources whatsoever. So let's look at these medication resources. And it's actually an area in the FHIR specification. If you look at the front page of the FHIR specification, it's actually a module, a grouping of various resources. And in typical workflow resource sequence as shown here, we have the medication request, in other words, the prescription. We have the medication dispense, mostly the handing over of the pills or whatever it may be to the patient. And finally, we have the medication administration. And that's to make a record of someone taking or giving a particular drug. Then we have the medication resource itself, and that captures the details of the medication, the actual thing that we are administering, and medication usage, which we will see later on. That is, for example, used if a patient self-reports on the medications that they are currently taking. But first, let's look at an example. So here we have Adam Everyman, a patient. And Adam Everyman has been prescribed a drug, medication request, so that's the FHIR resource used for a prescription, for two spoonfuls twice a day, and the prescribed medication is this one, amoxicillin 250 milligrams per 5 milliliters. Now, as you can see, this is the medication resource, but it identifies a generic product. There is no brand name in there, etc. This prescription for Adam Everyman is prescribed by a requester, which is Dr. Hippocrates. And normally the medication request, the prescription is picked up, and that's recorded as a medication dispense. And the actual dispense is done here by a community pharmacy, the local town pharmacy. They are handing over the amoxicillin to our patient Adam Everyman because he steps by the local town pharmacy. But the dispense is not a generic amoxicillin, but the dispense in this case is Smith's amoxicillin 100 milliliters bottle with an orange taste. So again, but now for the specific drug, we use the medication resource to capture the details. And medication administration, the actual taking or giving of the drug, well, in this case, it will be taken by the patient themselves. So usually we don't record this in any system that the patient has taken the drug, but certainly in a clinical setting like a hospital setting, and for patient safety reasons, you certainly would want to capture that. So let's have a look at the medication resource itself. So the medication resource is the actual medication that is referenced by the other medication resources, for example, in a prescription or in a substance administration. Now I'm showing you the highlights. So here I've created an extract, and I'm only showing you the data elements that are really of core importance in understanding the medication. And in this case, the code and dose form, amount, and ingredients, those are the core data elements, if you want, to describe the medication, whereby code plays the main role as the key identifier in most implementations of what this medication is. And mostly code is actually sufficient to fully identify the medication or the medicinal product. Now, the workflow itself, looking at the workflow, will start with a medication request. And the medication request, mostly known as a prescription, right, is shown here as being an activity that has a status. Is this an active prescription? Has this prescription been cancelled? Is this prescription completed? In other words, have we actually supplied the patient with the medication? And we have relationships, obviously, with the medication. That's an outbound reference. We have a subject patient. The prescription belongs to an encounter, and the medication request is authored by a requester, which is mostly a practitioner, but as you can see, it could actually be different parties as well. Medication dispense, just to give you a brief overview over all these relevant medication star resources. The medication dispense is obviously again about the medication that we are dispensing related to a patient, right? And the performer of the dispense is a practitioner or an organization, for example, if that's a pharmaceutical organization or a pharmacist. The medication dispense again can be active, on hold, cancelled, completed, etc. and contains dosage instructions. That's the printed stuff that we typically see on the actual medicinal product. We also have medication administration to create a record of the patient taking or a drug or a patient being given to a drug to the patient. And the medication administration again has a status. Is that process still ongoing, or have we stopped it for some reason? Obviously, there's a link to medication, and there is a subject, and the actual medication administration is done as part of an encounter. And the medication administration is a result of a prior medication request. Note that, as I identified earlier on, quite often it's sufficient for a medication to be identified via means of a code. This could be a SNOMED code or some other terminology that's appropriate to identify the specific medicinal product. So medication is modeled here in this administration, but likewise in the prescription, as either a code or a reference. And if it's a reference, then it's a full-blown reference to a full-blown medication resource, and which allows us to specify much more detail. So if there is no terminology, or it's some medication that's manually created or assembled by a pharmacist, there are still some of those medications, then certainly you will need the medication resource. And in other cases, the code may actually be sufficient. Right, we also have immunization. So that's not directly related to prescriptions, but immunization is quite closely related, obviously, to the actual administration of drugs. So immunization records the administration of a vaccine. Quite important nowadays, obviously. So the direct equivalent of that would be medication administration, but we need some additional details beyond that which you capture for a normal medication. For example, things like the lot number, expiration date, and that sort of stuff, right? So these are some of the actual data elements, extra data elements that you need when we talk about immunizations. Now, if we look at order management, and order management is a topic in and of itself within the FHIR specification, then they distinguish between requests, and those are things that we are asking somebody else to do, also known as an order, and events, recording data about events, things that have happened. For example, the fact that we have supplied the medication to a patient. That is something that has happened, and we will want to make a record of that event. Now, these two things are related to each other, because if we prescribe a certain medication, that's request in this model, then that results at some point in time in a medication supply and administration. So overall, we're talking about a request event workflow pattern. It's a request that ultimately results in some event. Now, one of the problems here is that FHIR, based on REST, as you know, most implementations, that's a repository model. What do we mean by that? Well, if we have a prescription, that is, we have a record of the fact that there is a prescription, it doesn't actually tell anybody to do anything. You're only passively recording the fact that there is a prescription, full stop. So that's a problem. We need something else to basically have a reference or pointer to this prescription, and then to go like, do this, or I want you to do this, right? So to have this sort of indication that we want people to do something, there are various ways to do that. It could be implicit in the context. If you and I are just two applications and you know that everything I post to you is something you have to act upon, then it's implicit in the context. If you use FHIR messaging, much like version 2, you could have a trigger event that indicates please do. So that's also not ambiguous. Or if you use RESTful FHIR, you'll have to use a special resource that has a relationship to the thing that you want to have done, and that task resource, because that's the name, that basically indicates please do. So how does this work in our medication workflow? Because that's the core of our presentation, right? So the task allows you to describe things like please do, but also please suspend and please stop. So to basically undertake some sort of activity. Now, if we start looking at the relevant resources again and how those are interrelated by means of FHIR references, then on the left-hand side, we see the medication request again. And the medication request is done by some requester. It is related to some medication, and the medication request is related to the patient. And we have task basically to identify that we want to have that activity done. On the other hand, we have, let's say on the pharmacy end of the workflow, we have the medication dispense, and we're dispensing the medication to the patient, right? And the performer of the medication dispense is here, mostly a pharmacist or some assistants. So again, here we have the task, okay? So task is a thing that sits in the middle. So this pharmaceutical application that creates this FHIR resource is not allowed to modify the original prescription, just as it's not up to the prescribing party to make modifications to the information captured by a pharmacy. So task is the thing that sits in the middle, just for workflow reasons, and this can be modified by both. So the prescribing system modifies these two core resources, and the pharmaceutical pharmacy system basically modifies these two resources. And task sits in the middle to exchange and support the status information of this particular workflow. Now, this task that sits in the middle can have lots of different statuses. So task can be requested, can be draft, can be accepted, rejected, in progress, or completed. And certainly when the supply of the medication is done, then we would expect the task, the central task resource, to be in the status completed. So let's have a look at a workflow example, a multi-step question or a multi-step workflow example. There's a 5-step example here, and let's start with the medication request. So the medication request resource, status active, which means that the medication has not been supplied yet, because otherwise the status would be completed. And the medication request was authored on 15th of June, and the dosage instruction is 2 spoonfuls twice a day, because we're going to reuse that Adam Everyman example that we saw earlier on in this presentation. So the medication request is done by Dr. Hippocrates, and the medication itself is amoxicillin generic medication, 250 milligrams per 5 milliliters. So the task in the middle, this one is also created by the party that created the prescription. And here they go like, well, yeah, it's a task of type prescription, and the task is requested, which means there is no party yet that has claimed this task, that they haven't claimed it yet, that they actually want to do this. So that's the next step. How does the pharmacy actually find out that there is a prescription on a central server somewhere? Well, you're going to use either a subscription mechanism, or you're going to do polling to search for all prescriptions that have not been fulfilled yet. Right, so here we see a search in FHIR that says, give me all tasks where the status is requested, in other words, where the task has not been done, okay, which are orders that have been assigned to me. Let's say I'm the pharmacy organization, and my organizational identifier is this. We could have tasks that were specifically assigned to me. For example, as a pharmacist, for example, if the patient has a designated pharmacy, then you can pre-assign a particular prescription to a certain pharmacy organization. Or if that's not the case, then the second search basically will give you all tasks that have a status of requested, that are about orders, and where the medication request status is active. So where the prescription itself related to that task has not been fulfilled. Okay, so now as a pharmacy, you're aware of the fact that there are non-fulfilled prescriptions on a server. And the next step, step number 3, is then for a local town pharmacy, our pharmacy organization, to effectively claim that particular task. I accepted, that's the new status of the task, and the thing is accepted by local town pharmacy. They haven't done anything yet, they have just accepted this particular task. And note that this one has not changed at all. Remember, because these two can be modified by the actual pharmacy system. Next step, number 4, is for the medication dispense to be completed. So the patient has showed up at a everyman, and they have been given not a generic medication, but Smith amoxicillin 100 milliliters bottle with orange taste, right? So once this is completed, then we can also set the task to complete it. Okay, and this is done by the pharmacy system. But here on the left-hand side, which is the resource that can only be modified by the system that created the prescription, the status is still active. Right? So at some point in time, this system is going to look at task and go like, ooh, it's completed. So that means that the status of my medication request can now also be modified to complete it. Okay, so now our prescription has been done and we have a completed dispense. So how about order, reject, cancel, and update then? I mean, we just saw a workflow scenario where everything works perfectly well, but obviously in real life use cases, that's not always going to be the case. So let's look at a rejection of a request. So here I have a medication request, created a prescription created by some order placer, and they have also created a task. And they have assigned that task to pharmacy A. And pharmacy A looks at this prescription and goes like, nah, computer says no, because you may not have the medication, or you may know of an allergy intolerance that basically prohibits you or disallows you from actually providing that requested medication to the patient. So basically what the filler then does, what this pharmacy A organization does, now I don't want to do it, they basically change the status here to reject it. And then the order placer who created the medication request is going to scratch your head and go like, okay, well, I'd better assign it then to pharmacy B. Okay, requested pharmacy B. And then B could decide, well, I have this product in stock. Maybe A didn't have the product in stock. And B basically says, okay, and then changes the status to accepted. So you see that this task acts as the workflow control type of resource that sits in the middle. Okay, that's sort of modified by both parties in this workflow for various reasons. The medication request, right, could also be cancelled. And so we saw that it could be in progress. So we started the medication administration, here recorded on the right, but then there was a problem. For example, the patient had to be sober or something, and they were not. So we started the procedure, but actually we had to abort it. And that again can be captured as a status in the task resource. But it could also be cancelled by a third party. So here we have the use case where Dr. Hippocrates was basically prescribing a certain bit of medication to the patient. And then some other practitioner, here Dr. Jones, discovers that there is a problem with that prescription. So now Dr. Jones created a task to request the cancellation in this case, and that request is related to that prescription. But obviously he wants that task to be done by Dr. Hippocrates, okay, because that's the original author of that prescription. So he's seeking Dr. Hippocrates' approval for actually discontinuing the original prescription. Now let's look at the active medication reason, the list of active medications. And as I told you, that's one of the key problems that a lot of projects are facing. One of the holy grails in healthcare is obviously, give me the list of active medications, give me the list of active allergies, and give me the active problem list. And so list of active medications is something that quite a lot of large-scale projects are embracing relatively earlier on in their projects. So what you want to do is to basically gather the information from all sorts of places related to medication information. And that's what this medication usage resource is all about. Medication usage, the content thereof is basically recorded or based on statements made by the patient. What medications are you actually taking? It could also be a related person, let's say a spouse. If the patient is not communicative, you can ask the related person what medications this patient is taking. Maybe you're looking at all medication orders, so medication request, medication dispense, and medication supply FHIR resources. And all of that information can sort of be recorded in multiple medication usage resources. And you would have one medication usage resource for each medication that the patient is taking. And medication usage, if we start looking at that in more detail, then you can certainly see that, again, this can be an active statement. Are they still actively taking it? Have they stopped taking the medication? Have they not taken the medication at all? And again, we have medication, we have the patient and the encounter that this belongs to, and the derived from relationship, because this medication usage could be derived from lots of other different kinds of FHIR resources. Now, this is a very good starting point. You basically look at all sources you have, however reliable you may find those, and basically import all of that information in your medication usage resource. But you will have to do some work on that, because that's not the end all, obviously. How reliable is this? And you will have duplications. So quite often, this process is combined with Questionnaire. Because what people do, and I've seen a couple of implementations and productions of this process, is they basically gather all the information from all sorts of resources related to what medications the patient is taking. Then they have a deduplication process to try and remove the duplicates as far as possible. And then they use that to basically populate a questionnaire. Now, if you're not aware of that, Questionnaire is also a FHIR resource. So you can basically create a questionnaire that shows, as far as we know, you're currently taking these and these and these medications. And you offer then the patient the option to go like yes, no, or no longer, or I actually take some over-the-counter drugs that are not on your list. So you allow them to basically modify the list. And this is ideal for the use case where, let's say, the patient is going to have a surgical procedure next week. So you actually have the time to send them a questionnaire and basically verify whether the medication list is still up to date. So the populated questionnaire, which is a questionnaire response FHIR resource, you can then use the answers and extract the answers again to create these medication usage resources. To reflect the fact, hopefully, that the set of medication usage resources that you have will be a sort of a true reflection of the medications that the patient is actually taking. There could also be some server-side logic involved in doing the deduplication and making decisions as to what are likely medications that a patient is taking. And then it would probably be some sort of FHIR operation. Here we called it $medication overview. This is something that the Dutch national project uses. But then there is some embedded server-side logic there that helps you in accomplishing this deduplication effort. Now, I told you that mostly it's sufficient to have a code for the actual medicinal product. And sometimes it's not, and sometimes you may actually seek additional information, definitional information if you want. For example, information that's recorded as part of IDMP. So the whole regulatory process. So whereas at the top of this screen, we're actually looking at the workflow resources that we just saw, medication administration, the medication itself, but also one that we didn't actually look at, substance and device, which are obviously related to medication in some way. Then there is a whole heap of underlying definitional FHIR resources that are also used in IDMP on FHIR. Now, these links that you're seeing here, these arrows, they're not actual FHIR references, okay? Because what we're talking about is mostly a link via the terminology. So if you have a code for a certain medication, then you can go to the definitional regulatory site and using that same code as an entry point, as a linking pin, so to speak, get hold of the additional details. So yeah, IDMP is on FHIR nowadays, so they're rolling that out, and this is going to be mandatory in the European space. So to summarize, what you've seen is some key aspects of the various medication resources and how you can support those to support a standard medication workflow. And that's using the task resource and a request event pattern. And that the medication usage resource can be used to solve the list of current medications question. But it also involves server-side logic and some questionnaire stuff. And we have seen that there is a link between the workflow resources and the regulatory IDMP resources. So with that, I've come to the end of this presentation, and feel free to drop me an email if you want to, rene@fhir.ly, and I will aim to look at the questions right now, if any came up. The only problem is I briefly dropped the website, so I will have to open up Whova again. Sorry about that. Some glitch on my end. Let's go to the session Q&A. Okay, well, if we look at the questions list, then let's just take them one by one. And if we don't get to them, then I will certainly answer them after this session, so you can read the answers later. Q&A are persisted on Hoover, so in that sense, that will work just fine. So when you're planning to administer a vaccination and it didn't happen for some reason, the patient was too unwell on the day, how are you managing that? Well, actually, there is a status in the substance administration as well as in the vaccination resource that allows you to identify that you aborted the process. Earlier on, I used the example of somebody not being sober, which was a prerequisite for the administration of a medication. And that's the similar sort of example. We started the process, the patient is already has entered the door, but then they suddenly make a statement that makes you abort the process. So there is a status both in the vaccination resource as well as in substance administration that allows you to capture that. How should you handle situations where anesthesia, like anesthesia, where the prescribing, dispensing, and administration happens simultaneously? Is it just scripting all the steps to happen instantly? Well, actually, there is no requirement that you actually have a prescription at all. So when you're focused on the administration of things, then the mere recording of an administration of a certain drug may be sufficient. Now, that may not be the full answer, but I'm not a pharmacist, so that would be best followed up on one of the pharmacy-oriented or medication-oriented channels on chat.FHIR.org. But my initial response would be that there is no need for a prescription. Obviously, if you swallow a painkiller, then obviously there is no prescription, but there is certainly an administration. This is a very interesting flow of events. Beside the resources, wait a second. Beside the resources, there are a lot of behavioral requirements for the participant. Is this an implementation guide or will this be added to an IHE profile? Well, IHE profiles are also implementation guides, so in that sense. But yes, there are a lot of contextual components and workflows may differ on a country by country basis. So there is certainly not one golden way, basically, of supporting this workflow. What I've presented here is kind of the standard workflow that you tend to see in a lot of countries, but obviously there are a lot of tweaks and options to this, and that will indeed have to be detailed in an implementation guide. Some countries have already done so at quite a level of detail, and actually there is a US implementation guide that's actually pretty detailed on this, but I don't have the link here. But yes, you have to document that in an implementation guide. Is it correct that MedicationUsage is a brand new resource, not released yet? Well, actually, this is known as medication statement in release 4 of the FHIR specification, which is the current normative specification. But this resource is not itself normative at this point in time. So it has been renamed in FHIR Release 5, which is the current draft version that everybody's working on, to MedicationUsage to better reflect as to what it does. So is it new? No, it's not new, but it has gotten a new name. And I tend to use the latest and greatest names from the latest build. So you'll have to forgive me. How would you record the stopping of an existing medication for an inpatient in hospital, for example? Well, certainly you can, when it comes to administrations, there then won't be any administrations anymore. But other than that, even in the medication request has a status again, and that status could be indicating on hold. So the on hold status on the prescription is typically used when the patient is in the hospital, and then upon discharge, you may wish to set the status back to active, which means resume the prior prescription. If medication dispensing is happening at an external pharmacy, is it adequate for the external pharmacy to have internet and be FHIR compliant to receive medication resources, especially with their ID, or are there other requirements like being part of a hospital panel of pharmacies? Well, very good questions, but these are up to jurisdictions to decide and on the implementation guides that are actually used in a particular context. So that's impossible basically to respond to without knowing the exact context of your question. Should we record future medication requests under task resources only? Well, future medication requests, well, as long as there is no task, then you're not asking anybody to do anything, right? So you can record whatever you want in a medication request, and there is a time and a status in there that would indicate that those are related to or pending and that sort of statuses. So they could be activated at some later point in time. But for myself, I would not create a task resource for a future prescription, because you may actually drop your concept of a future prescription before you actually get down to asking somebody to perform it. So for a future medication request, I would only create the medication request and not the task. There's a detailed question here on an infusion medication that requires a diluent. Well, again, that's outside of my league, so that's probably something you need to follow up on chat.fhir.org, because I wouldn't know how that's actually represented. Will the medication dispense resource have two references of medication? One from generic medication request and the other medication that's actually dispensed? And no, the medication dispense has only one reference to medication, because in the dispense, the only thing that's relevant is the thing that we are actually dispensing. So in our example, Smith amoxicillin, orange taste, etc. If you want to know what the original prescribed medication was, you would have to follow the reference from the dispense directly back to the prescription, and the prescription has a reference to the medication that was originally prescribed. So from the dispense, we only reference one medication, and from the request, the prescription, we also just reference one particular medication. Could this workflow be used alongside with CDS hooks? Well, certainly. And if you start looking at CDS hooks, then at the moment that you are prescribing something or thinking of prescribing something, then obviously you could invoke a CDS hook to get feedback or an evaluation of the thing that you are prescribing. And that in turn could obviously influence your prescription process. That's a very generic answer, but it's probably not going to get better than that. But definitely you can combine those. It's a very explicit purpose of CDS hooks to support the prescription process. I see one more question. That's about event sourcing in CQRS, but I'm actually not familiar with that. So that's a question that I won't be able to answer. Sounds more like one for the perhaps somebody does know the answer and they can respond to that in the chat window. That would be my suggestion. And otherwise, please visit. In this case, I think this will be one of the, not even the medication, but one of the more infrastructural channels on chat.fhir.org. Let me see, do we have any follow-up questions? Let's look at the chat. The chat comments that, yes, I jumped over one question on the CQRS because I don't know the answer to that. And that's why I jumped over it. So sorry about that. but perhaps somebody else can comment on that one on the chat window. Is there anything else right now related to the medication workflow? Because if not, then I would like to thank you all, and I would urge you, if you have an interest in this topic, then task workflow has a separate channel, a separate workflow channel on chat.fhir.org, and there is a medication channel also on chat.fhir.org. And with that, thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of your Dev Days. Speak to you later.